Okay, so so myself and Bronwyn, we set up Vegan Sustainability Magazine some years ago, just because just more and more research. I see Benny Malone is in the group there. People like Benny were gathering together lots of research papers. Um, People like Truth or Drought in the US. So lots of different organizations were starting to bring together the research. And we also started to do it here in Ireland. A lot of it was focusing on more global things. So tonight's talk is going to look at these different issues. So from an environmental perspective, um, greenhouse gas emissions is just one factor. And, for biodiversity is another indicator. So there's multiple different indicators, and one model that's used is this planetary boundary model. So food systems have huge impacts on planetary boundaries. And we'll take a look at a couple of the metrics, specifically land use and greenhouse gas emissions. We'll also show how meat, dairy, and fish undermine food security. A transition to a vegan food system is healthy for people, it's beneficial, and it can save lots of money. And we'll also highlight how the production of meat, dairy, and fish is a huge source of food waste. Now, one term that you mightn't have heard about is the carbon opportunity cost of food. So we'll highlight a little bit of research on that. And humans now occupy most of the planet. And so in order to have large scale ecosystem restoration, you have to have a vegan food system. So what I'd suggest, what I would like is, as we go along, if people have a question or if people want to challenge something, feel free to do so. Or if people have links that they're aware about and they want to put in the chat box, they can do that as well. Now, this is a model that kind of will be about what I'll be talking about today. I'll be talking at the start about events and patterns. So they are the effects, the direct causes that we can see, meat, dairy, and fish production cause. And then in order to try and resolve those issues, one way is to look at the systemic structures that support those events that are happening. And those systemic structures include things like subsidies, like public bank investments, like the World Bank, supporting industrial meat and dairy production in different parts of the world. But underlying that are people's perspectives, people's mental models. So, Sandra Higgins, she often says that veganism is easy when you know why. Of course, there is the how to be vegan. You have to take a look at that as well. But when you know the why, because other animals are sentient, they have rights, and therefore we should respect those rights, and therefore also not harming others, being compassionate to others is also good for us as humans. But first, I'm going to start looking at events and patterns. So this is just a model showing the boundaries. So on climate change, we're transgressing that boundary. For biodiversity loss, we're transgressing it. Land conversion. In the bottom right, you see nitrogen and phosphorus loading. That's also from agriculture. So 6 of the planetary boundaries are significantly impacted by the food system, including freshwater withdrawals and air pollution. So at the same time, you've got the social foundation. So this model incorporates what is donut economics. Lots of you will know about that. Kate Raworth's model. And in the interior, we're trying to meet various social goals, you know, within the planetary limits of the that we have on the planet. So this is from World in Data, which is a website from one of the universities in Oxford, and it shows some of those different metrics. So greenhouse gases. So when this was done, it was 26%. I'll highlight some new research showing 34% of global greenhouse gases comes from the food system. Agriculture is occupying half of the planet and 70% of the fresh water. And eutrophication, again, that's the nutrients that comes from slurry and comes from fertilizers. And now livestock make up 94% of mammal biomass, excluding humans. So because we've occupied these ecosystems, we've taken the food sources from other animals. Sometimes we've hunted the animals off those ecosystems, or sometimes we've just displaced them and they've died of hunger and so on. So globally, we're having a huge impact, and it's the food system is driving that. So this shows the 5 leading causes of biodiversity loss. So habitat degradation is basically the conversion of ecosystems into agricultural systems. And the thing to remember is that ecosystems are like, they're the supermarket, they're the housing, they're the nursery, they're the healthcare system for all the other species. And when we convert ecosystems to agricultural systems, that eliminates them. And exploitation is things like fishing and hunting. And so you can see from the diagram, the red and the orange is between 2/3 and 80% of the causes of biodiversity loss. Now, when I'm talking about changes in the food system, the highest levels of meat consumption by far are in Europe, North America, South America, and Oceania. But also countries like China are also having a huge impact because their level of meat consumption continues to rise, and there's 1.4 billion people there. So this shows land uses globally. So the yellow on the left shows crops. The pink on the far left, that shows all the built up areas in the world. So it's just 1 to 2% of the land. So agriculture uses half of the land. And again, the vast majority of that is used for grazing. The other major impact on ecosystems is deforestation. Okay, so that's just what this image is telling us. So animal agriculture occupies 82% of the farmland, producing 18% of the calories that people consume. And, you know, in countries like Africa, in countries like Nigeria or Kenya, people consume much, much lower quantities of meat than we do in Europe. And of the blue sector, you know, that's arable land. 40% of that goes to feed farmed animals. And in Europe, it's closer to 80% of the cropland goes to feed farmed animals, chickens, pigs, and dairy cows, and also intensive cattle beef production. A lot of the farmed fish are being fed by fish meal and fish oil products, but also grain and protein crops also. And this is what happens. You get a diverse grassland on the left-hand side, and it's converted. So on the left, you'll have lots of insects, lots of pollinators, lots of invertebrates. And on the right-hand side, there's no flowers, so there's no food for any of those insects. And there's no habitat, there's no housing, you know, so they can't survive. And the same thing happens when we convert complex forests to, Sitka spruce plantations, which are very common in Ireland. And so this is just, if you go to Google Maps, natural ecosystems across 70% of Ireland, which is much higher than the rest of the world is, close to 50% of ice-free land. But in Ireland, because of our history, it's higher. So 70% of the land is converted to these, areas with really, really minimal biodiversity. Along the hedgerows, of course, there is some, but we know also they're impacted by farmers. So just picking a couple of the metrics. So land use, if you take a look at, from sheep, from cattle, and if you compare it to soybeans, soybeans are grown in Europe as well, mostly for human consumption. But the vast majority of soybeans in South America are genetically modified, and they're all for animal consumption. But you can see for a kilogram of tofu, it just takes 3.5 square meters. And so for beef or sheep, you're nearly 100 times more land is needed. So that's a key thing. In order to restore biodiversity, you have to reduce the footprint of the foods you're eating. And of course, if you're vegan, you're not eating fish or, so the fishing fleet now is impacting most of the oceans as well as the land. And there's just one comment there from Paul. So a vegan food system, now sometimes there are communities in Africa that don't have alternatives. So obviously this is directed at Europeans, and often, in fact, European fleets, and more especially, to be honest, Asian fleets are fishing off the coast of Africa. And in countries like Senegal, China has established fish meal and fish oil plants, and they are hoovering up local fish resources and converting them to fish food for fish farming in Europe and in Asia. So the industrial fishing fleets of about 5 or 6 countries globally are also fishing off the coast of Africa. And that has detrimental impacts on people who have limited choices in terms of what they're eating. So in terms of greenhouse gas emissions, this is a recent study that shows that 1/3 now of all global emissions comes from the food system. So some of it is methane, some of it's carbon dioxide, some of it's nitrous oxide from fertilizers. So 1/3 of the global emissions, 34%, comes from food systems. In Ireland, we're at about 37%. And you can't see that, but that just says that 2/3 of food system emissions comes from farmed animals. So, we've people who are looking at this will have seen the figure from the FAO of about 14%. But the more recent studies are showing that it's about 20, 21, 22% for farmed animals. So that's a giant section of the global greenhouse gas emissions. So across all the different stages of the food system, so that 34% is not just on the farm, it also includes retail, food waste, home consumption, packaging, and transport. So often you hear people talking about food miles, but that only makes up, about 5 to 10% of the greenhouse gas emissions of a food product.
I just called the birds on the phone.
You're joking.
Are you coming? I'll show you this. Or are you busy?
No, I'm not busy.
Maria. So 70% of the emissions are from land use change and from on the farm. Okay. So food miles doesn't matter.
I'll just stay there, just watch that. Just let
I
me
just
see
want
it.
to see his mic
Doesn't
going.
matter, I'll do it, I'll call you when I'm ready.
No, I go out.
No,
No, it's okay.
So also in Europe, crops for animal feed use the vast majority of nitrogen inputs, and nitrogen reductions, that's one of the reasons in the Netherlands that's putting a lot of pressure on animal agriculture and is causing it to be reduced. So there was a European Court of Justice ruling that farmed animals have to be taken into consideration in countries' national obligations for emissions of nitrogen. And here in Ireland, An Taisce are also taking a case around the nitrogen inputs from animal agriculture in Ireland. So that's an important kind of argument for one legal route for reducing animal agriculture in Ireland. Now, animal agriculture undermines food security because it takes perfectly edible human food, feeds it to farmed animals, and the vast majority of that food gets wasted. So this again is from World in Data. There are different arguments about the food conversion ratio. This shows that it takes 25 kilograms of feed to produce 1 kilogram of beef. So for different animals, there's different levels of waste. So sometimes for poultry, you hear about 9 kilograms of food for 1 kilogram of poultry. So, but basically it's very inefficient. Meat production is increasing globally, so even though in Europe, in some countries, including Ireland, the per capita consumption is dipping in Ireland slowly, it's dipping in countries like Germany more rapidly. But even in a country like Germany, where domestic consumption is decreasing, production in Germany is still increasing. For all the chicken and pork and dairy and dog pet food being produced, 1.25 billion tons of human edible grain and legumes and oil seeds are consumed. And that's enough to feed a further 5 billion people. So that's the scale. So when people talk about, the war in Ukraine undermining global food security, the war in Ukraine, because Ukraine does export some of its crops for human consumption to countries like Lebanon, Egypt, and other countries, it is a factor, but much, much greater is the channeling of all this food which could be consumed by humans to farmed animals. So in Ireland, under our current production, 1 hectare of land can feed 1 person if they're eating beef, or it can feed 20 to 45 people on a plant-based diet. And that's just looking at current yields in Ireland right now. So in Ireland, it would be easy for us to feed our current population and, many tens of millions more on much less land if we wanted to do that. So now we're going to take a little look at some of the systemic structures. So mostly we're just going to highlight what some of the subsidies are. So this is an article by Marco Springman in The Conversation, and it's highlighting some research he did showing that globally there's about 200 billion on farm subsidies going for meat and dairy. And it's going for foods which are detrimental to people's health also. And there's almost no subsidies going for fruit, vegetables, legumes, nuts, and whole grains, which are great for people's health. And for fisheries, there's about 35 billion annually going for fishing subsidies. So in Europe also, the Common Agricultural Policy and the European Maritime Fisheries Fund. They're the two instruments now that are supplying subsidies for animal agriculture on land and also industrial fishing in the waters off the coasts of Ireland. If those subsidies were redirected, it wouldn't stop animal agriculture. It certainly wouldn't stop dairy in Ireland, but it would have a huge impact on beef production in Ireland. So this is from some research showing how the agricultural land would be reduced if people adopted different diets. So no beef or sheep consumption would reduce land use by that much. Down to people on a vegan diet, it would reduce the land we need for agriculture by 75%. And then all of that land could be used for restoring ecosystems. So that's a massive change. Now, obviously, if you look at land in Ireland, 70% of the land is occupied, and farmers have no intention of giving that land for different uses, the majority of farmers. But if beef farmers could be allowed to keep their subsidy, and as a condition for keeping their subsidy to stop animal agriculture, that would allow some of the ecosystems to recover. But politically, there's no political party who would touch that in Ireland at the moment. Now, one thing that did happen recently is the Department of Agriculture modified one of their conditions of payment, and it now allows beef farmers to have scrub or wetlands on 50% of their land and still keep their subsidy. So that actually could make a significant difference. So that's just that was research published by Pura Nemchek, which has become, quite a well-known paper. So it's huge level reduction, and it is really the kind of single opportunity humans have for restoring biodiversity. The UN declared this decade the decade of ecosystem restoration. So there's a lot of, there are some significant projects happening and there's talk about it, but until there's that shift in the food system, in particular in Europe, which has some of the most degraded land in the world, it won't be possible to have large-scale ecosystem restoration. And that's just commenting on the food. That was research done in 2013. There's more research done by more recently, just showing the scale of how much calories are fed to farmed animals. Right now, we produce enough food before food loss to feed about 3 times, to feed 24 billion people. But because of food loss and the huge amount fed to farmed animals, it gets reduced. So another area that's going to impact animal agriculture is the agreements to reduce methane. So at the last climate summit, the last COP, it was agreed to reduce methane globally by 30%. Now, methane comes from fossil fuels, from extracting oil and extracting methane for burning as a fuel. It also comes from waste from landfills, and it also comes from agriculture. So the Irish government has signed up to that agreement to reduce methane by 30%. And over 90% of the methane in Ireland comes from farmed animals, from animal agriculture. But it's unlikely that the government will stand over that. So this is just to talk about, I think it's fair to say that this concept is common in economics. Sailesh Rao has done a lot of work highlighting this. The the carbon opportunity costs. So because, for example, the food system in Brazil, through, you know, various political influences and so on, JBS and lots of other big companies are driving beef and soy production in Brazil and South America. Then when you make that choice to produce that type of food, then it has huge opportunity costs. So in other words, if you chose to eat legumes, you could have a fraction of the land, and then you could allow the forests to recover. Yeah, Roger. So we'll talk about that at the end, maybe, because subsidies are key in Europe, especially. So that opportunity cost amplifies dramatically the harmful impacts of beef and dairy, and even things like shrimp, because of the way they're produced, and because the feed that's given to shrimp falls down to the bottom of the ponds and it produces methane. You know, so a vegan diet, so this was research published a couple of years ago, and it shows that by transitioning the Eat Lancet diet, some of you will know about this Eat Lancet report. So that showed how if we want to transition to a food system that stays within the planetary diet, then we need to reduce meat consumption in Europe by about 80%, and meat and dairy in Europe by about 80%. And by doing that, you can restore the ecosystems on that land, restore the wetlands, and restore the forests. Now, and those forests gradually, year after year, they'll continue to sequester carbon. If you allow these forests to be permanently established, they can continue to sequester carbon. Of course, even when the trees will reach their peak age, they'll fall over, but then that carbon will be very, very slowly released, and there'll be further growth. So certainly it slows down when they reach a peak age, but old growth forests continue to sequester carbon. So that shows that 15 years of current emissions from fossil fuels could be sequestered by 2050, which is massive. There is nothing, you know, approaching that level of sequestration in any energy transformation system. Now in Ireland, of course, we're hearing in the media, energy prices are going up massively. And the cost to change the other systems of transport, of energy systems, and industrial systems is going to be gargantuan. But the cost to move to a vegan diet, restore ecosystems, it would be cost neutral at the very best, at the very worst. So the Eat Lancet report, it says that you can replace all the animal products by whole food plant-based diet if you want. So it's not promoting veganism, this article, but it is saying that for Europeans, there needs to be an 85% reduction in order to stay within the planetary boundaries. And it also highlights these are just extracts from that same report, the ginormous health benefits and other co-benefits that come from this transition to a plant-based food system. So they're really huge. So still, you know, like more and more, there's, you know, these messages are supported more and more. There's a research paper came out recently looking at tens of thousands of different food products and showing that the ones that are healthiest, the whole food plant-based diets, are also the more sustainable ones. So that's a continuous message. So just to tunnel into Ireland a little bit more, just so that we have a good sense of what we're looking at. So beef farmers are on the right there, the 27 and the 31. So 58%, 68. So 73% of the of the farms in Ireland are beef and sheep production. Dairy is 17% and tillage is 7%. And nearly all of that tillage, except for some oats for human consumption and some barley for beer production, it goes to farmed animals. But then Ireland also needs to import millions of tons of other supplementary animal feeds. So just to remember that 70% of the land more is beef and sheep production, because that kind of can show here. And this shows the scale of the subsidies, okay? So this is for 2020. So now for dairy farmers, the payments that each dairy farmer on average gets a check of 20,000 euros in the door. And that just makes up 28% of their family farm income, FFI, in the year. Now for cattle rearing, the average cattle farmer in Ireland gets a subsidy of 14,000. Now that's 157% of their income. And that means that they run their business at a loss. And this cattle other is just another form of beef farming. And also they run their business at a loss, and sheep farmers run their business at a loss. So 70% of farmers in Ireland, if they stopped animal agriculture and they could keep their subsidy, their income would increase. Now this isn't the case across Europe, but it's the case for beef production in most places in Europe. So we know that other sectors are trying to transition, and there are huge challenges to do that. But there is an opportunity economically. An awful lot of beef farmers in Ireland, especially in the west of Ireland, are part-time farmers. So there's an opportunity there, but of course, farmers are going to fight against any change whatsoever. So this shows their income. So these are the two different types of cattle farming in Ireland. The income 9,000 and 15,000 sheep farmers. So that's 70% of land in Ireland. Now, dairy farmers produce more emissions per farmed animal, and also more nutrients go into the environment. But because they're so profitable, it's going to be, and the conversation in Ireland is still around profitability, that's a bigger challenge. So, okay, so I won't go into that one. So that one didn't show. So this just shows in Ireland our greenhouse gas emissions. So blue shows carbon dioxide and red shows the methane. So 37% of Ireland's greenhouse gas emissions comes from agriculture. But when you include the other segments of the food system, 50% of Ireland's greenhouse gas emissions come from the food system. And now there's research showing that. And this shows that of the methane in Ireland, all of it, basically all the green, is agriculture down the bottom, with just a little bit from waste. So if that is to be reduced by 30%, it would reduce, it would have to reduce cattle by 30, and it's mostly cattle, but cattle and sheep by 30%. So finally, these are some of the things happening in Europe. So because of the European Court of Justice, nitrogen, the Netherlands is obligated now to reduce nitrogen. And so there's been big protests over the last few months in Europe against that. The Danish government, they're investing 100 million in plant-based foods. So that's going to see lots of plant-based food companies starting up in Denmark. Sorry, that's in Denmark. And that's going to be a huge boost. And though all those companies will be big employers, very profitable companies. So that's a very smart move. And then in Ireland, the Irish government agreed a 25% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions by 2030. You know, farmers are saying they're angry about it, but whether it'll happen or not, of course, remains to be seen. So there are loads of ways to do things, but I do think, you know, I do think some political representation in Ireland will be needed, you know, with a vegan mindset. You know, and then, you know, lots of you, obviously, you're involved in different elements of this, and I'm sure there's other ones, in order to shift the food system. So I'll stop share there now. Hi Tracy, how are you? Yeah. So there are some of the thoughts. Yeah, Piotr, 3.1 million tons of animal feed imported. From Tracy, the vegan land movement seems to be having some success through crowdfunding and rewilding. Does ag land change hands too rarely? It's a factor, but the main reason it doesn't change hands rapidly is because of the subsidies. Because the subsidies are paid on a per hectare basis, then that slows everything down. Because farmers, elderly farmers now, they're leasing the land, and when they lease the land to somebody, that person gets the subsidies but pays the rent to the farmer. So that's what's slowing down all the movement of land. So the subsidies is a big driver for slowing down the land. And also the subsidies is something that keeps other businesses investing in farmland, but not necessarily transitioning it back to ecosystems. So, there's quite a few things. So just to go back to Roger's point there, the role of the animal advocacy movement in subsidies, like, you know, the subsidies, just from what I know about the CAP system, it's complicated and it's negotiated in Europe, but from the last renegotiation, a lot more freedom has been given to the national governments. Now, the current, like the Fianna Fáil, Fine Gael, and Sinn Féin, you know, they don't have, Sinn Féin has a different policy. They want to reduce the cap on the subsidies and give smaller farmers more subsidies. But none of them are talking about stopping animal agriculture on the land and allowing farmers to keep the subsidies if they allow their land to go back to nature. So so the decision is going to be a political one, and it is also a political one in conversation with the Department of Agriculture. So until there are vegan politicians in Ireland, I think it's going to be a challenge. But right now, people are feeling the crunch of energy prices. And in order to transition the energy system and the transport system by 2030, it's going to cost 100 billion. But if you transition the food system, you can have a huge impact on Ireland's emissions. You can have a significant impact on how much we can sequester at a fraction of the cost. You know, so Ireland's food, of course, the food that Ireland produces is a high-end food, so it's not contributing to global hunger at all. As Piotr has been writing, it's undermining food security because, you know, about 5.3 million tons. I think I've seen a figure of 5.3 million, Piotr, in a recent Board BIA report. You know, so that's 5.3 million tons of feed plus 45 million tons of grass gets converted to 1 million tons of meat and 1 million tons of milk solid. So the inefficiency is mind-boggling. And it's unhealthy food, you know, so there's stories around exporting milk powder to Asian countries, but most of Ireland's food exports do go to the UK and Europe. You know, yeah, so in terms of, so Roger, would you have any comments on that, or would you have any thoughts? You can unmute yourself, can you?
That should be it now, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah. On the subsidies, I think it's obviously going to be a big front in terms of the political thing. People will know the name Ronnie Lee, and he's saying the same as you, really, that we need to move into politics at this stage. In terms of how to do it, of course, it is a major problem, especially when you could say that looking at Europe and beyond, there seems to be a move towards the right in politics, and also within the social as well. So that doesn't kind of bode well. I just wanted to say, by the way, James, that you say in very calm tones about the end of humanity. It's really quite interesting the way that you're able to put it over like that. But but yeah, I don't know. I mean, obviously we talk about a massive job to be done in the future, but in terms of focusing on politics, it's probably about time. And I've always argued that perhaps it's the subsidies where we might get the start, the basis of the question.
So there's continuing downward pressure on the subsidies. They're still, you know, nearly 40% of the EU budget. 80% of them in Europe go to the biggest 20% of the landlords. So you have situations like Viktor Orban in Hungary donating farmland to other supporters, and then they get the subsidies and so on. So there's a lot of corruption involved in it. Now this allocating to the national governments more power is an opportunity to shift things just in Ireland. Like politically, the Netherlands, Germany now, they have a Green Party minister for food and agriculture, and one of his pillars of food system transformation is plant-based foods, one of his 4 pillars. So some shifts are happening. Like, you know, I was a member of the Green Party for a couple of years in Ireland, but the programme for government had nothing at all about food system change. And I suppose I don't know, I wouldn't have, you know, a huge pile of confidence. Maybe Tracy, you might, would you have any thoughts on that? No. So, so I think it has to, you know, like, I do think, do you have anything to say on that, Tracy?
On the bigger point about advocacy.
But also just on politics in Ireland.
No, I put a question to you, James, in the chat here about, did you get any feedback at all from the politicians? I know that your report that you did on vegan agricultural system was distributed to all the TDs. What was that, a few years ago after you produced that? I know Nara helped you distribute that, right?
That was Laura Broxton distributed it. That was about 3 years ago.
Okay.
Like
Did anyone contact you?
Not one. No, like myself and Mark Cronin, we did meet with Pippa Hackett before the election. You know, like Pippa's a beef farmer, you know, so it's, you know, so
yeah.
You know, so.
If none of those 12 TDs, those green TDs, will even, you know, say that they're vegan or become vegans, I presume that none of them are. Well, you know, what hope do we have? Like, that's really
I
depressing.
Think, not much.
Well, the hope is Sentient Rights Ireland, obviously, given the fact that we're here. I'd like to do a little kind of follow-up again on subsidies. One big issue at the moment is crop deaths. And so the two things kind of come together in the sense that have you done anything into looking at alternative systems like vertical farming, all that kind of stuff? Because those would solve a lot of issues from a veganic point of view, but subsidies would surely be needed to bring it about.
Oh yeah, shifting the subsidies will be good. There is, you know, like, I haven't read the book now, but you see Laila Kassam and her father, they've got this book, Rethinking Food and Agriculture. So he worked for the Food Aid Organization for years, supporting a no-till method of agriculture called conservation agriculture. And that's actually has been adopted on about 10% of world crop production land, and it uses a non-plowing system. So it has much less impact on soils, and also much less impact on life. The only other systems that I've come across that are, very effective, like is the work by people like Vandana Shiva in Derrida. They have agroecological systems that are really biodiverse, and they're small scale, they're low fossil fuel inputs, and they're legumes based, so, but whatever agricultural system you have, it's going to harm biodiversity, because when humans occupy space, they displace biodiversity. Some animals, like most mammals, will just shift homes, even though homes are very difficult to move, just if humans are regularly talking in a particular area. So that does happen. Now that might be, in cultures where there's a lot of hunting and so on, and maybe in cultures where there isn't, it might be different. So
we already know, don't we, in the vegan argument that we would free up a lot of land for free living beings by creating a vegan world.
yes.
And I just wondered whether, actual vertical farming itself was something that you've looked at, because one argument in the mix of things is the fact that Irish farmers say this all the time, is that I can't grow anything but grass where I live.
That's a common argument in Ireland. Now, in the west of Ireland, the land, like obviously Ireland just has its history of being colonized, and then the forests were cleared. So by the late 1800s, it only had 1% forest. And in Europe, the average is 40% forest, so that's a huge, and of course, people were starving. And then through all the struggles of the land movement, people then got the land and it was distributed, but it was really survival, and loads of people, as we know, didn't survive. So the whole island has been 70–80% of the land is occupied, and the other 20% are the bogs. So, so Ireland has a very good growing, like we could produce enough food in Ireland to feed easily 70 million people on half of the agricultural land we currently use, easily. And that's just using current yields. Now that's using current yields. So if we shifted to an organic system, which you would want to do, you could knock a fifth off that, but still there's no problem with meeting easily the Irish population's food multiple times over, with peas, beans, whole grains, barley, rye, oats, wheat. We wouldn't no longer be importing wheat for bread. We import all our bread flour now.
We'd become an exporter, not an importer, wouldn't we?
Exactly. Like currently, Europe is a massive net importer of food calories. Economically, it's a net exporter in terms of profit, but that's just because it takes huge numbers of food calories from poor countries and converts them to high-end products that it sells. But Europe is a massive net importer of food calories. So that's one of the startling things, you know. So there's a recent and it's the same for our fisheries, you know. Europe imports half of the fish we consume, and also we're also importing fish meal and fish oil, even from African countries, even though you know, obviously that's undermining their food security. So there's a recent WWF report called Europe Eats the World, which kind of explores some of these things actually. And of course, there's lots of things like in Ireland, there's human trafficking in the fishing industry. There's all these, you know, in the meat industry, there's very irregular contracting systems for meat plant workers and so on. And the unions have done quite a few reports on those also. So there, sometimes, you know, like there are maybe the meat and dairy system is very well supported. And if you could shift a few of the supports and bring multiple pressures to bear on the system, it can shift. You know, so like if the meat processing plants had to pay workers a living, you know, wage and give them holidays and all the rest of it, that would put a lot of pressure on the meat plants, you know. So there are different things that could be done. But how to do that, you see, is a challenge. So I'll just go back.
Could I just ask a question?
Yeah.
Okay, great. I was curious about, as we're talking about like sort of the big picture of how things are in Ireland. It seems to me that there have been some changes for the better, but I'm not really sure because, you know, I'm seeing things from Boston, but currently, but the, you know, it just seems like there is more awareness of the need to have more vegan methods, but I'm just curious, is there anybody who's, it sounds like there's nobody politically who's upfront and articulate. Are there any other high visibility people? I mean, I'm just sort of just curious what the big picture is. Things are just basically miserable. I don't know.
Maybe, I don't know, Dennis or Carol, if you want to, would you have any thoughts on that politically in Ireland, what the situation is like?
Or culturally, just in terms of
culturally. Oh, I think, you know, because of the work of loads of groups and loads of people,
right,
you know, like Roger, Vegan Education Project, Vegan Information Project, you know, Sandra Higgins. So there's Ireland's meat consumption is declining. And you know, the number of people who identify as vegetarian or vegan is still small. But Ireland's production of meat and Ireland's production of dairy is growing, and Ireland's production of beef is stable. So Ireland's production of chicken and pork is steady or growing, you know.
Okay.
Dennis, would you have any comments on that? At least on the political side of things.
Yes, on the political advocacy of what we're talking about, it comes from, in the main, socialist politicians. Just to mention one person that comes up again and again is Paul Murphy, TD. But that's mostly about animal welfare, single issues, where the stance is made in the Dáil, the Parliament. Also, it would be something like trying to vote down grants for greyhound racing. But in terms of what we talked about tonight of food production, there is no move on that. There is nobody advocating for it. There is nobody advocating for animal rights as opposed to animal welfare. And that's why Sentient Rights was created last December,
right,
to fill this void. and be the vehicle for change and put our flag up and say, look, we're animal rights, we're not animal welfare. We want a move, a transition peacefully in evolution to a plant-based economy and society. And that's what we're about. And this program that we're doing tonight, this webinar, is a key pillar of what we're saying, that this transition needs to happen. It can be done. And the benefits that Ireland would reap once we got there is enormous. We would become net exporters of we achieved. It just takes will, it takes political will. And I think the one big card we have is the rise of veganism, that this is a kind of a grassroots movement happening within the people themselves. It's not necessarily a formal thing, it's just this awakening happens in an individual. And I don't think animal rights or the move to a plant-based society ever had this before. It was always coming from organizations. So I have a lot of hope for the future, but we have a mammoth task ahead of us in bringing about the change and the political will. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Dennis. So, Benny, do you have a question or a comment or?
Yeah, Benny sent me them actually, James, if that's okay. He said, Roger, can you ask about the claim Sacred Cow make that most of what animals eat are byproducts or crop residue? That's the first one.
Okay. So I can show one thing perhaps. So that's not fully true. So there is some truth to that. But I can just show. And what's the next question? And I'll find something then to show you that can answer that question, Roger.
Also, an English farmer was claiming growing oats to replace cow milk wouldn't save any land.
Well, that's not true. So like you get about 8,000 kilograms of oats from a hectare. Now, so I'd have to do the exact numbers on it. But because we know that in a liter of oat milk, I don't know, is it 5 or 7%? But it would be easy enough to do that research and see what would come out with it. But like obviously then from that perspective, the emissions from producing the dairy is way higher. But also I do have an image showing that the land use for oats is much less than the land use for a liter of milk. So there is so I could show you that slide. Let me just show you this one slide here, just for 2 seconds to answer the former question. I don't know if you can see that. Can you see that research, that image, approximately?
Well, I can.
You can. So here, these are total edible crops, and that's showing like about 5,900 calories per person per day. These are all the calories that are not human edible calories. So this quantity of calories, about 1,700 calories per person per day for everyone on the planet, is fed to farmed animals, and we get back about 594 calories. Are you with me? So this little brown sector, so that's the soybeans, the wheat, the barley, you know, and other crops that are edible to humans. But this 39, you know, all of these calories, they come from, you know, like for example, in Brazil, the beef is produced by cattle grazing on just ecosystems that are burnt, and then, you know, whatever grows back, they just allow them to feed on that. So they need much more land. And that's the other point about that, is that when you have, when you say grass-fed beef, the way to think about it is ecosystem-fed beef, you know? So it needs precious ecosystems that's displacing vast biodiversity to feed these animals. But it's not true to say that and certainly in Europe, you know, 80% of crop production in Europe is going, and they're edible crops for humans, is feeding farmed animals. And so for chickens and pigs, the vast majority of the food that they eat is human food. But for ruminants like cattle and sheep, there's a mix, but still it's ecosystem fed crops.
Yeah, so it's a mixture, but I mean, even every time their conversion rate is never good, is it? So
no, and
there must be-
the conversion rate for extensive agriculture is worse than the feedlots in America. You know, because they live longer, so the greenhouse gas emissions per kilo is higher, just to use that metric. But the displacement of, you know, countless organisms from the ecosystem and also, you know, in South America, they're displacing, you know, indigenous people from those ecosystems, you know, and, you know, there's, you know, low-level wars going on in some of those communities. You know, so that's
to follow on from what Benny asked. I think farmers are likely to say, well, if you don't use the byproducts for animal feed, even though it's not very efficient, it's going to be wasted. But there are alternative use for byproducts, like building, for example, right?
There are alternative uses, but like one of the things that's been happening over decades is the organic carbon in the soil is going down. And when you leave all of those crops on the land and you're not plowing the land, then the carbon in the soil is sequestered much, much better. Now there's multiple crops in Ireland, you know, whether Ireland used to have a substantial flax industry. So flax produces linseed oil. The linseed can be used for linoleum and the flax can be used for clothing. So that was a huge industry in Ireland before, employing thousands. We could do the same with hemp, you know. So on the Farmer's Journal, you know, there was, you know, articles saying that we could create an industry employing 80,000 people with hemp alone in Ireland, you know. So economically, it's a no-brainer, the transition, but it's the age profile of the farmers now, they're not able to transition. And for the meat processors, it's just a kind of a massively subsidized product that they get in that amplifies their profitability. That's the meat processors are the ones content with the current system, you know, so they're making millions, you know, off the current system. So it's 8:05 now. Was there anything else, Roger? No, that's so.
I just wanted to flash these in front of people because
very nice.
People have been waiting for them, they're ready. These are the new Sentient Rights Ireland badges, so they'll be winging the way to somebody who picks them up.
Very good. Okay,
Thank you,
everyone.
Roger.
Yeah, thanks for your time. And Benny, I can send you that link on the land use on the milks, and I'll take a look at the oats and so on. Okay.
So the recording will be available sometime.
Yeah. I'll send Carol the recording. Yeah. Okay, folks.
James, just to
Tracy,
say,
we must meet for a cup of coffee when I'm up in Dublin.
Thank you, James. It's very
Yeah,
good to hear
thanks,
again.
everyone.
It's always
Yeah.
interesting. Thank you very much.
Keep well.
Thank
Thanks
you.
a lot.
I'll see you.
Yeah.
James, just to
Bye.
say thank you very much, and we'll change over to Carol, and we'll stop the recording now. And thank you very much, James. This has been a complete revelation. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks very much, James.
Yeah.